Hi, everyone. Anne O'Connell with OC Publishing here, and welcome to this week's author journey. I'm sorry for a bit of a pause over the last couple of weeks, but family situations needed to be taken care of. But I'm very happy to be back. And today's guest is a very special guest. We've had her on before, and I'm really excited to have her back. We have today Dorothy Ann, or D.A. Brown, who is a retired registered nurse and current writer, freelance editor, and fiber artist. She lives in beautiful Kingston, Ontario, with the occasional foster cat. I approve. Her children are scattered far and wide, but continue to offer balance and wisdom. She lives with multiple sclerosis, which always makes life interesting. Her non-writing time is spent volunteering, facilitating a variety of courses, and occasionally playing the ukulele. She used her interest in and knowledge of past and current medical practices, as well as the experiences of nursing students, both her own and others, to create Ruth McLean's story in Spit and Polish. Let me just show you this beautiful cover. This is what's coming out later this week. We're going to learn more about. She plans to follow Ruth through her nursing education in subsequent novels, which is exciting to think that there is another one coming. This is Dorothy Ann's second novel. Her first, Recycled Virgin, was published in 2020. She's a writer for Medium and a reviewer for Readsy and the Nonfiction Writers Association. Her blog, dorothyannb.com, talks about writing, editing, and living with MS and more. So let's bring Dorothy Ann up. Please join me in welcoming Dorothy Ann to the author journey. Hi, Dorothy Ann. Welcome back.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I can't believe it hasn't been 4 years since you've been on, has it? 2020, Recycled Virgin?
No, I think our last interview was just a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I think I had him on for something, Tim Covell.
Okay, yes. To talk about Somewhat Grumpy Press.
That's right. That's
yes.
right.
And I should have said both of your books were published by Somewhat Grumpy Press, who we love. And yes. You are the original founder of that.
Yes.
Indie press.
Name was my idea, which I think is I kind of am fond of that idea, given that publishing is sort of one of those things that you feel somewhat grumpy about sometimes, but because there's a lot of work involved.
It is a lot of work. Yes, it brings a lot of joy to our lives, but there are moments of grumpiness. And Tim is I'm here in Nova Scotia, and Tim, of course, is a romance author here in Nova Scotia, so we cross paths a fair bit. So I love Somewhat Grumpy Press, so I'm really happy to have you back. And this week will be launch week for Spit and Polish.
Yes.
How excited are you?
Oh, I'm over the moon. It's when I published my first book, Recycled Virgin, it was in the middle of COVID, right? So nothing really happened. So this time I'm quite thrilled to have this opportunity, and I have a couple of readings coming up where I'll get to bring my book around and do official launch things. So it's very exciting.
Oh, I'm really pleased. Well, we'll get you to do a reading in a minute, but tell us a little bit about the storyline and what Spit and Polish is about.
Well, Spit and Polish is about a nursing student in 1946. I specifically wanted to pick the in-between, like after the war years, because everybody writes about the war years. And I thought, interesting things were happening after that. But anyway, so she's this sweet young thing who's a minister's daughter, and she's stuck in Cloyne, Ontario, which is this tiny town up north of Kingston by about an hour and a half. And she's trying to escape because her father wants to marry her off or make her work for the church. So her mother arranges for her to apply to nursing school. So she comes down to Kingston General Hospital's nursing school and starts off there. And unfortunately, she starts off, but she's a little bit clumsy. She's just not fast at doing things. So they bump her to a tuberculosis sanatorium to build up her skills. And so the story is about how she works through that and the things that happen to her as she's going through this year of nursing prep, and what happens at the end when she, finally gets out of the tuberculosis.
And lots of realism in this this novel. Sort of, it's a fact-based, true story-based fiction, right? I want to give a shout out to everybody who's watching. If anybody has questions for Dorothy Ann or myself while we're chatting, please feel free to throw them in the comments. And I wanted to say hello. Francine Cosman is watching today.
Oh,
And
nice. Hi,
yeah, hi
Francine.
Francine.
Love.
She's an
Yep.
OC publishing author who we recently published her memoir, Nurse, that you very kindly did a blurb for. And so I think there's probably a lot of similarities. So talk a little bit about when we were sort of backstage, you talked about your first placement, because you were a retired nurse. So you did go through nursing training at Queen's in Kingston, correct?
Yes, that's right. And when we were chatting, we were talking about, like, when I went through it was the baccalaureate program. And I purposely didn't use that program for this book because the Kingston General Hospital nursing grads are still friends years later. They're really tight.
Oh,
and,
nice.
And I don't get the same vibe from the Queen's ones. We were a little bit more competitive. But anyway, so leading into the first experience, we were just young green at the whole thing, and we got sent to look after.
Oh, we've
because you had to handle people. You had to handle the things that came out of them. You had to wash them. You had to pose them. You had to feed them. So you had to do all the vaguely gross things about nursing and sort of get into that comfort level of dealing with intimate things with nurses. And that's sort of what happens with Ruth in this story. She has to get in and really deal with things that aren't the most pleasant. And I think sometimes when we read stories about nurses, you think they just dance around and, interact with doctors and things. But really, when push comes to shove, you have to touch people and you have to communicate with them and you have to deal with their bits. I think it's very important for nursing students to have that experience.
And so how long did you work as a nurse?
I had to retire when I was 50 because I got MS and my brain sort of started not functioning properly. But before that, I worked on and off. My ex-husband was a military guy. So we moved and moved and moved and moved. And so we just get someplace and I'd get a job and then we'd move again. But I worked for, probably 25, 30 years.
Awesome. Well, I lived as an expat for many, many years. And from my experience, from what I saw, nurses were always in demand no matter where you went. So probably was a good profession, although it's hard to get up and move all the time.
That was actually, I kind of, I empathize with Ruth in my book because when you move, you can sort of reimagine yourself. It's a way to sort of recreate yourself different ways. And actually that's been my story with MS too, because as the disease progresses and things change, you have to reinvent yourself each step of the way. So yeah, I think it was good training for the rest of my life. So I don't that.
And you have a blog. I'm just going to bring up your there we go, DorothyMB.com, and that you write about those experiences on your blog as well, correct?
Yes, it's sort of a varied blog. I used to have an MS specific one, but I haven't been doing that because sometimes it's not good to focus on a chronic disease that you have.
Right.
So sometimes you want to focus elsewhere. So most of the time I write about life and the universe and everything. So yeah.
So this is the homepage of your blog, DA's Ephemera and Etceteras. I love that.
Well, because it's not permanent, right? So it's ephemera. So yeah.
Yes, I love that. And you talk about your book and a little bit about yourself. And so if anybody wants to learn more about Dorothy Ann through her blog, it's DorothyMB.com. So I'm wondering, this is probably a good time to shift a little bit and maybe read an excerpt from Spit and Polish. Would you like to do that for us?
Sure. I think I'll read from a little ways in. My eldest child has always told me that the best way to judge a book is to turn to page 40 and read that. And then if that intrigues you, then you're good at the book is probably going to agree with you. So I'm actually I've gone further. I'm on page 98. So the section that I'm reading, Ruth has been in the tuberculosis sanatorium for a while, but she hasn't told her father about it because she was sort of demoted and sent there. And she's sort of running a little bit of a lie, which is very scary with her father because he's a minister and tends to take these things very seriously. So he's just come down and realized that she hasn't been in nursing school all this time, and he's threatening to take her home. So they fight amongst themselves and with the supervisor, and she agrees that Ruth can take her father over to the sanatorium so he can see what it is that she's been doing. So here she's just coming into the sanatorium, and they've just driven over. Ruth took his arm and walked him to her ward, peeked through the doors. She so hoped no one was bleeding out at the moment, or naked. But she knew how impatient her father could be, and she wanted to show him quickly before he even grew more determined to take her away. She glanced at the men. Good. Everyone lay tidied into bed, and no one was using a urinal or anything. She breathed deep with relief. Miss McLean, a cheer rose from the men. What are you doing here? Aren't you off for the day? Asked George. I am. This is my father, the Reverend McLean. He's here to visit and check out what I've been doing. Ruth turned to her father, who stood frozen in the doorway, staring agape at the men. She suddenly viewed them with fresh eyes, non-nurse eyes. They did look ghastly. A few seemed relatively healthy, playing cards at a table in the corner of their ward, but the great majority were pale, gaunt, breathing with difficulty. One lay crookedly, swathed in bandages after a rib removal. Ruth hastened to straighten him in bed, and he thanked her in a soft voice. Other patients had tubes coming out of their chests, draining into large bottles set into buckets of sand. A couple looked even worse, completely slumped over, most of their ribs and lungs gone. Their skin tone almost matched the sheets. Despite this, they raised a hand to wave to Ruth. Ruth, used to the sight, smiled back at them. Her father glanced at her and shook his head. A moment passed. Finally, Mr. McLean rubbed his hand over his eyes and stood straight. He reached into his pocket and brought out a Bible and a notebook. Hello, boys. Can I pray with you? Then it was Ruth's turn to be amazed as she watched her father travel from bed to bed, speaking to each man softly, writing down their names and addresses, blessing many of them. She'd seen him often in the pulpit, but not so often in his one-to-one sessions with parishioners. He was surprisingly gentle with them, his voice lowered from its usual fierce growl. By the time he had finished circling the ward, though, he looked almost as pale as the men. Ruth saw how ministry wore on her father and felt a stab of guilt. Was she being horrible, not wanting to go back and help him? Ruth, abashed, joined the other nurse on duty, and they made the temperature rounds while her father prayed. At last he finished, and he and Ruth left the ward. Reverend McLean shuffled down the stairs, groped his way to a nearby bench, almost fell into it. Ruth, startled at the change in her father, ran to get some tea. When she returned, her father's color had improved, and he was sitting up straight again. He smiled at her, reached for her hand. I'm fine. He exhaled. What a reminder of the last war. I hope never to view such carnage again. The stories they told me. What happened to all the boys wrapped in bandages? Had they been shot? Those are hideous injuries. Some of them could barely breathe. Ruth leaned her head on her father's shoulder. No, father, that's part of their treatment. The doctors here collapse the lung with the tuberculosis in it to keep it from spreading until the rest of the body strengthens. Sometimes, when the collapse works well, it cuts off enough oxygen to the infected area that the cells stop growing. So she explains about all of that, and her father eventually admits that she's needed there. And he says, Ruth, I had hoped to bring you home. Your mother needs your help too. As you know, she's expecting again. Father, why? That can't be good for her. He had the good grace to blush. But she will need help. Ruth waited. She would not give him the answer he wanted. And it seems like you may have learned some useful skills here that would be a help to her. The boys said you gave them excellent care, kept them tidy, and so forth. Ruth's heart sank. Surely she hadn't made her own bed to lie in, had she? She'd die if she had to go back to Cloyne. He gazed at her again. I note you've learned to keep your mouth shut when it needs to be, too, he said, gruff, with a twinkle in his eye. He shook his head. I don't know what to do, my shining girl. I want you home. I miss you around the place. But I saw how happy the boys seemed when you went in and how efficient you were looking after them. I think they do need you. I hope that Bill, that's her brother, or other veterans would have such caring attention if they needed it. She breathed. She hoped. I'll give you another 6 months. If you haven't proved yourself by then, I'll expect you back home. Understood? There you go.
Yay! It's like I'm leaning forward. it's just, it draws you in. It's just very descriptive. It's very beautifully written. And I want to also recognize Helga Sansom, who has joined us. She says, hello, Dorothy Ann, looking forward to your new book. Yay.
Nice to see you.
And just to reiterate, it's available for pre-order now and coming out on the 29th, correct?
Right.
29th of February, yes. I wanted to kind of back up a little bit because I did read Recycled Virgin when we did the interview a couple of years ago and loved it. Very different novel to this one. Recycled Virgin, sort of the reincarnated lives of the Virgin Mary, over 2,000 years, just to be really brief. Such a different approach. So why this novel? Like, has this been sort of brewing for a while? Based on your experience, or
they sort of follow in the same path of historical fiction. I'm looking at both things like that. This book really spoke to me. I did a placement in the old tuberculosis sanatorium when I was a nursing student.
Okay.
So I've been there. And in addition, my father was a tuberculosis patient there after the war.
Oh, wow.
So when I moved back to Kingston, I thought, I should look into this and see if I can create a story. And I had worked with some of the KGH grads when I worked in public health here. And I loved the fact that they were so close to each other. I just think it's fabulous. So I got together with them and I interviewed a bunch of them. And then there's a museum of healthcare here in Kingston, which is a really neat place. You can see all sorts of intriguing and unusual things.
I bet.
Like they have the little sputum cups that they use for tuberculosis, and they have body parts, and it's all quite gruesome and wonderful. But anyway, that's where I got the cover picture for the book, because that's an actual KGH nursing student uniform. So anyway, so all of those things kind of combined, and I went looking for this TB sanatorium that used to be there. And it was in these H huts that had been built for Alcan employees way back during the war.
Wow. Okay.
For female Alcan employees. And when I went there to see it, it was already falling down. And then they changed it to Anguanada, which is a wonderful place for children with severe disabilities. And they had all the children there, and that's where I did the placement. Since then, Anguanada has moved to a much nicer facility, and most of their people live out, which is great. Anyway, so I went looking for this building and I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't in any pictures anywhere. So that intrigued me too. So I really enjoyed doing the research around Kingston at that time, and the story just grew from there. And the experience of being a nursing student, there are all these books out about how medical students are, pushed and treated badly. And I think, nursing students really aren't all like Cherry Ames. There are multiple bad things that can happen to you, and actually they do happen to poor Ruth. So it's especially at the time that she went through nursing school, and even in my time when I went through in the 70s, you were very much looked down upon, right? And you had to obey everything, and it's a real challenge if you've been raised to have your own mind to have to put up with that. It becomes a thing.
There's so many parallels to Francine's book, Francine's memoir, and she says, can't wait to read the book. I can't wait to get her a copy too, right?
Oh, that's so good. I really enjoy it.
Tim has joined us. Hi, Tim. He says, great selection for reading. The title has a military connotation. Did nursing used to try and follow military models for discipline and so on?
That's a really good question, Tim. Actually, nursing started out being sort of one of those jobs that loose women did, or people who are really down on their luck. And so good old Florence Nightingale came along. She said, no, we want to make this a profession. We want to do it properly. So there are lots of quotes from Florence Nightingale in my book, because she was sort of the first professional nurse person. And because of that reputation, I think, people were very, very strict with their students. Like, they were shut down at night. They couldn't go out. Any misbehavior, you'd be called on the carpet. I actually was called on the carpet at Queen's because I was too short to be a nurse. So anyway, that started me off on the wrong foot, and I ended up being a mouthy student. So that got me called on the carpet a few other times.
I think you and Francine need to meet.
Yes, it got me into some
She
trouble.
was a little bit of a rebel too.
There we go. Yeah, well, I think now that's more accepted, but certainly in Ruth's time, you speak up, you get crushed, and so she really has no agency through this book. Like she's just gradually trying to claim herself as she goes, and I think as she goes on in her nursing education, she'll be braver and more willing to do things. But right now she's got like the sword of Damocles hanging over her. If she messes up, she gets shuffled back to Cloyne and has to marry this guy who wants to have many children and read Bible verses to her every night.
Right.
So
the plumber, right?
yeah, she doesn't really want him. Thanks.
So I was so taken with that. Do you want to read the other excerpt that you have? A little short
I just
excerpt?
had the beginning one. Well, I can do at one point she gets totally vexed and all the bad things are surrounding her. So she decided she was going to go for a walk on nearby Wolf Island, which is this lovely little island just outside of Kingston. And it has a ferry that is supposed to run back and forth. But I found out when I was doing the research, that ferry has been having trouble since it was created. And I don't know why they don't just build a bridge. But anyway. So she goes off for a walk with her friend Betty. And she calls him Betty, and the two of them took a bus downtown from KGH, grabbed the morning ferry, the wind blowing tears from their eyes. For a change, the ferry was actually running. The government had just replaced it with a brand new one, and the girls exclaimed over the shiny brass and fresh paint. The old one had been half broken down for years. There wasn't much to see or do on Wolf Island, but it had the benefit of isolation. Ruth felt she could talk safely there. "As long as we go to the pub to warm up after," said Betty. "I promise." They disembarked from the ferry and walked around Marysville until suddenly Ruth burst out crying. "What am I going to do?" Ruth wailed. "Patricia, I'm sure it's her, has been going around spreading lies about me all over the sand. I even yelled at the patients the other day." Betty gasped. "You what?" "They were all looking at me like I was acting like some Nathaniel Hawthorne Scarlet Woman." Have you been? "Betty, what do you think? Do I seem like the type to be lying about on beds with patients?" "No, but I did hear you were pretty popular with that young Dr. Anderson." "He's married, you goose." "For some, that doesn't matter. For me, it does. He asked me to help him with the cast one day, and he said he liked the way I did the wrapping." "I bet he did. You are a pretty girl, after all." "Oh, be quiet. You're ruining everything. Now I'll feel so awkward working with him, and he was being so nice, and the OR nurses were so kind to me. Oh, it's ruined. I doubt they'll ever let me go back to nursing school now." Betty blew on her mittened hands. "Are we almost ready to go inside? It's freezing out here." "Betty, you are not being any sort of help." "What do you expect me to say? I'd give my eye teeth for the attention you've got from the docs. No one is offering to teach me new things or do, in fact, anything with me, unless it's downtown at the bars." "Perhaps that's why they don't call on you." "Ooh, watch out. It bites. Look, Ruth, why not let it just blow over? You know it will. If the docs like working with you and the nurses are as friendly as you say, it will all be back to normal in a few days." "But Patricia—" "Do not engage Patricia. She's a viper. Some of the other nurses on the ward worked with her before. They were ecstatic when she was demoted to the SAN." "Demoted? But wasn't she sent over as an experienced nurse to mentor me?" "Oh, dear God, no. You really should gossip now and again. You learn all sorts of things. The nurses that worked with her used to hate being on shift with her. She'd let all her IVs run slow and then turn them up fast when she took off for dinner break. Everyone would have to restart them, and the veins would be blown. The poor patients ended up bruised and sore on both sides." "Really? She's always nagging me about that." "Just don't ever offer to cover for her for meal times." And she kept going missing. She'd be nowhere to be found when the patients wanted pain medications, and they'd eventually find her in the lounge laughing with some doctor. They loathed working with her. "So why did she get assigned to me, I wonder?" Betty laughed. "I imagine Mrs. Graham and that devious mind of hers thought you'd be an excellent influence, shining so angelically she'd hate to show up all dirty-winged beside you." Ruth stopped, waved her arms about. "It is cold. Let's head back, shall we?" So then they go into the pub.
Love it. So, of course, inquiring minds want to know, what are you working on next?
So Ruth is, she at the end of the story, good things happen to her, and she ends up back in nursing school. And so I wanted to write more about the different experiences that you have in nursing school. I specifically wrote about tuberculosis in this one because TB treatments were really primitive at that time. They had just basically started with antibiotics. And so if you had tuberculosis, you either went into a sanatorium for years and rested, or they sliced and diced you in thousands of julienne, like julienne fries. So you'd lose your ribs, you'd lose part of your lung, and you'd end up walking all hunched over and everything. It was really very unpleasant. So I wanted to write about that because that's a time that is going to vanish in people. And unfortunately, tuberculosis is coming back. So it may be something that we see again because we have antibiotic resistant tuberculosis now.
Wow.
But
that's frightening.
Yeah, well, yeah, actually, there's a lot of TB in Canada right now, actually. A lot of it is treatment resistant. So it's something to be aware of, certainly for medical people.
Of course.
So I want to follow her into her next placement. And I thought, well, what will I write about for the next one that will have advanced in the years since then? And I thought, psychiatric care. So I've got her going to the old psychiatric hospital that was here, Rockwood. And it's a scary building. It's still there. It's this big looming limestone building. And at the time it was a really forward-looking type of building for people with psychiatric problems, but now it just looms and looks dangerous.
And did you do a rotation there as a student nurse?
I did a rotation in the more modern version of it as a student nurse, and it was one of the rotations that I thought, this frightens me. I guess because I've always been worried about losing my mind, right? I don't know why, but I guess because I depend on my mind a lot. It really worried me to have people who had no concept of reality. And then while I was there as a nursing student, I went to coffee with another nursing student. And when I came back, one of the guys that I'd been chatting with was all trussed up and thrown into the safe room. And I thought, oh, what's that all about? And they said, oh, he was looking around trying to kill you. And I thought, oh,
oh, nice. I know I have vivid memories. My sister is a nurse, and she was doing her nursing training when I was in junior high school. And she used to tell me stories about, the worst rotation in her mind was the psych ward. So, oh my goodness. So Tim has another question. Were there many sanatoriums at the time, one associated with every hospital or in every town, or would the San and Kingston take in people from a large part of the province?
That's a really good question too. So there were sanatoriums all over, but they weren't funded. Like we didn't have Canada Health Care then. So all of the sanatoriums were funded by local municipalities, and some places like Hastings, which is the next county to us, they couldn't be bothered funding a sanatorium there. So they just funneled everybody over to Kingston. And the same thing happened in a bunch of different places. So there'd be like one sanatorium, and then everybody would be funneled in from all over. And it was actually quite a drain on the city or town that had the sanatorium there. So they would ask for money to help cover the expenses. But again, it was like pulling teeth because basically they just wanted those people gone. Yeah.
Oh, it's so sad. So you're working on the next book, and will there be a third, or will you wrap up in the next book?
I think she may have,
maybe one.
I think exploring the psychiatric area will take me a book. And the other area of nursing care that had changed really dramatically was maternal child care.
Okay.
So I was thinking that would be another placement that would be interesting to send her on after this one, because this is going to be a really hard one for her to get through, and bad things are going to happen around her again, because that's what makes a story fun.
Exactly, makes a story. Well, I, for one, am really eager to see the next one come out, and really appreciate you coming on to chat with us on the author journey, and welcome back, and congratulations on the launch. Very excited that that's coming. So where can people get Spit and Polish? There it is.
Oh, thanks to my excellent publisher. It's going to be up on, that would be Somewhat Grumpy Press with Tim at the head. It's going to be everywhere. It's already up in all the ebooks are everywhere. And you can start ordering the paperback from places like Amazon, Chapters, Kobo, and actually even just your local bookstore, because people can go on and order a copy of it and have it come in. So I really encourage you to do that, because local bookstores need all the support we can get.
Exactly.
And just
And
for
probably at Dartmouth Book Exchange here locally, I imagine.
imagine, and there is a reading thing coming up here in Napanee, just north of Napanee, for the Napanese Writers Guild, and that's April 6th. So for people who are in the local area around Kingston, they can look for that and then come and see me.
Oh,
I'll
that's
have presents.
awesome. And then if they want to learn more about you, they can go either to dorothyannb.com
Right.
or somewhatgrumpypress.com.
That's right. And you
Lots
can
of
order the
places
book directly from there too. So
Oh, excellent. Okay. Well, Dorothy Ann, it's been so nice to see you again and to chat again. And we look forward to following your journey and having you back sometime in the
thank you
not too
so much.
distant future.
Thank you so much again for inviting me. And I'm sorry about the technical problems. For people wondering, I'm talking on a phone because my son's internet. I'm looking after his cat in Vancouver.
Oh, very nice. How nice of you. Well, we had a little freeze earlier on, but it went just fine. So not a problem.
Excellent.
So,
I'm glad.
thank you so much again. We'll see you soon.
See you.
And thank you for joining us on the author journey today. I'm Anne O'Connell with OC Publishing. Happy reading, happy writing, and we'll see you again next week. Take care. Bye for now.